I'm Dr. Leslie Pritchett, the Chief Scientific Officer of BrainScope, and thank you for your time in watching this video. For your interest, each short video in this series focuses on a different aspect of BrainScope One technology. This video focuses on BrainScope One's FDA Validation Trial. Over a development period of greater than 10 years, BrainScope conducted 21 clinical studies, including 55 clinical sites, contributing to 5 FDA clearances, culminating in that for the BrainScope One. BrainScope One algorithms were developed using a large independent database of approximately 2,400 head-injured patients and controls. 2 algorithms were derived using the same EEG data: the structural injury classifier for the likelihood of brain injury visible on CT or advanced neuroimaging, which is a weighted combination of EEG features spanning multiple measures which characterize the EEG signal in traumatic brain injury. Additionally, it includes selected clinical signs and symptoms, considered manifestations of the physiological changes caused by or risk factors related to TBI. The EEG Brain Function Index indicates the likelihood of functional brain impairment and is a weighted combination of EEG features that most closely reflect current consensus on the physiology of concussion. An independent prospective clinical trial demonstrated the efficacy of the BrainScope One algorithms in support of the FDA clearance. The primary endpoints of the validation trial included efficacy of the structural injury classifier, that's the sensitivity and specificity for the likelihood of CT positive or CT negative, and secondary endpoints including the brain function index scaling with severity of functional impairment, and clinical utility of the equivocal zone for ternary classification of CT positive, CT negative, or equivocal. Inclusion criteria were ages 18 to 85 years, traumatic closed head injury within 72 hours, and a Glasgow Coma Scale of 13 to 15, including concussion or MTBI. Exclusion criteria included a history of brain surgery or stroke and critical condition requiring intubation. The validation population included 720 patients collected at 11 clinical sites. There were 156 CT positive patients, of which 73 had measurable blood greater than or equal to 1 cc, and 564 who were CT negative. The mean age of the population was 43.6, and the mean GCS score was 14.9. This list shows you the 11 major U.S. clinical sites that participated in the validation trial. This slide reviews the results of the validation trial for the structural injury classifier. We're focused now on the left side of the TBI spectrum, that which is visible on CT, and we've blown it up here in the center of the screen so that we can see all of those abnormalities that were CT positive. The sensitivity to any CT positive abnormality was found to be 97%, and the negative predictive value was 98%. As we move to the left, increasing pathology, we reach 1 cc of measurable blood, which is the smallest amount that can be reliably detected on a CT scan, and we see the sensitivity jump to 99%. To put that in perspective, we have to go all the way to the left to 30 cc's of blood before a patient is even referred for a neurosurgical consultation. So BrainScope One is shown to be sensitive to even the most mild of CT positive pathology. The full performance metrics of the structural injury classifier are shown in the table below. In the top row for the binary output, where we're looking only at CT positive or CT negative, but no information about how close a patient is to the threshold. And in the bottom row, when we include the equivocal zone and use the ternary output of CT positive, CT negative, or equivocal. In the sensitivity column, we can see that the sensitivity with the equivocal zone as positive jumps to near 99% for the presence of 1 cc of blood or greater. Specificity was well above that for standard clinical decision rules such as the New Orleans criteria or the Canadian CT head rule for both the binary and ternary output. Details of the study are published in the Journal of Academic Emergency Medicine by Hanley and colleagues in 2017 and discussed in a separate video in this series. This slide shows the performance in the validation trial of BrainScope One structural injury classifier in relation to many other screening devices and neuroimaging tools that are used routinely. BrainScope One sensitivity can be seen here at the highest level of medical screening devices, at the top of the scale at 97 to 99%. For example, mammography is in the middle of the scale at 69 to 90%, and troponin for an MI within 2 hours of the event is at 25 to 65%. So the highest bar of difficulty for performance with a target population that's extremely mild, we see BrainScope performs at the extreme level of sensitivity as compared to these other screening devices. BrainScope One specificity scales with severity of functional impairment. Specificity relative to the CT scan can be an underestimate, as it's calculated only taking into consideration brain injuries visible on CT. This is supported by the fact that specificity was shown to scale with severity of functional impairment. In the table shown here, we used a clinical algorithm based on the number and severity of clinical symptoms to group the patients as having none to mild symptoms, moderate symptoms, or severe symptoms. And the specificity of the structural injury classifier can clearly be seen to scale, being the highest in the mild cases and the lowest in those with more severe symptoms. How to think about the equivocal zone. Binary classifiers do not provide any information on how close the patient is to the threshold. They report only if the patient is likely positive or negative. In the diagram shown here, we have two triangles. The one on the left, the black one, showing CT negative patients. The red on the right, showing CT positive patients. The dotted line indicates the threshold of the classifier, and anybody to the left is likely CT negative, and anybody to the right is likely CT positive. But you have no idea whether the person is very close to that threshold or very far away. We've added an equivocal zone around the threshold that allows us to indicate those patients who are close to but not over the threshold. This is now giving you information about how close the patient is and allowing you to consider the need for additional assessment or observation in patients who fall in this category. I want to point out that only very few patients, around 10%, will fall in the equivocal zone, but it is important to identify them, very much like standard practice in medicine does today for pre-diabetics or pre-hypertensive patients. The inclusion of the equivocal zone also decreases the already small number of false negatives in BrainScope One in the validation trial, going from 7% to 2%. And also it's of note that none of the false negatives were found to be clinically significant, and all were discharged from the hospital with no further need for clinical intervention. The validation trials on the Brain Function Index demonstrated a clear and significant relationship between the Brain Function Index and severity of functional impairment, measured by symptoms and severity of symptoms, for both the percentile and the categories. The table on the right shows you the level of significance achieved in the validation study, comparing severe patients to mild patients in the top section and severe patients to moderate patients in the bottom section. The more severe the brain injury, the lower the EEG brain function percentile. When the percentile is low, patients have a significantly higher likelihood of being severely functionally impaired. Details of the derivation and validation of the Brain Function Index are provided in Hanley and colleagues, 2018, the Journal of Neurotrauma. In summary, the BrainScope One validation trial successfully met all endpoints and exceeded main targets. The validation trial results supported the FDA clearance of the BrainScope One device. Sensitivity to intracranial brain injury was extremely high with outstanding negative predictive value, and specificity far exceeded that of standard clinical decision rules. The use of the BrainScope One as an adjunct to triage decisions in mildly presenting head-injured patients has the potential to increase confidence in CT scan referrals and reduce unnecessary scans, to provide important objective information on brain function impairment and more informed referrals, and aid in making the clinical diagnosis of concussion. This last slide is to remind you of the BrainScope One core labeling elements for the assessment of the full spectrum of brain injury. Thank you for your interest in choosing to watch this video, and I encourage you to look at other videos in the series. Thank you.